Tuan-tuan dan puan-puan, welcome to Stratford To Subang, a new series on Shakespeare, Malaysian drama, and Malaysian Shakespeares. From bangsawan performances to modern films, Shakespeare has been performed and adapted in Malaysia for over a century. But how did the bard first end up in Malaysia? And why do we keep returning to his works? In this first episode, we'll explore these questions with Dr Kok Su Mei, a senior lecturer at the University of Malaya's English Department. A scholar in the field of Asian Shakespeares, Dr. Kok has written multiple articles on the bard, including What's Past is Prologue, Postcolonialism, Globalisation, and the Demystification of Shakespeare in Malaysia. She currently teaches literary analysis, 16th to 18th century drama, and of course, Malaysian Shakespeares. Before we begin our journey, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more updates. Terima kasih hadirin sekalian, and enjoy the podcast. Gentles all. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions first just to warm up, right?
All right.
Okay.
It's just like a game show already.
The game show. Yeah, I suppose so. All right, Doctor. What's your favorite Shakespeare play?
Ooh, Much Ado About Nothing.
Much Ado About Nothing. All right. Do you have a favorite Shakespeare quote?
I don't. No.
You don't. All right. If you had to be one character, who would you be?
I'd like to say something really cool, like one of the villains or Lady Macbeth, but in reality, I would probably want to be one of the very minor characters who just watches from the sidelines. There's a character in Titus Andronicus. He's just a boy. He's just called boy. He doesn't have a name. And he's just perpetually perplexed by the world around him. And I think that would be me.
Right. Yeah, I think in Julie Taymor's version, he kind of is the main character, right?
That's right, yeah.
Do you have a favorite Malaysian Shakespeare adaptation? And that doesn't have to be in performance, just an adaptation in general.
That's really hard to answer because they're all so different. But the most recent one that I loved was Rundown Macbeth, just because it was really colorful, really vibrant, and quite a spectacle, which is unusual. So that was a really good one.
And what does the term Malaysian Shakespeare mean to you?
I suppose we're looking at Shakespeare in its various iterations across the board of Malaysian experience, whether it's in the education system, whether it's in casual conversations, of course, theatrical performances and film performances as well. But yeah, just wherever you find Shakespeare appearing in the Malaysian scene, that's Malaysian Shakespeare.
We're going to be talking about Shakespeare's Malaysian journey, or at least I think that's what we're going to call it, who knows. But we're also going to be talking a little bit about your own personal journey as well with Shakespeare. And I know I've asked you this 100 times, but do you remember your first exposure to Shakespeare?
Right, yeah, I mean, I tell this story all the time, right? There is a bit though that I've not told you before. I'm sure I would have come across Shakespeare when I was quite young because I used to dig about in my grandfather's very dusty bookshelves whenever we went back for Chinese New Year. And in those dusty bookshelves would have been all the leftover school books that my dad and his sisters would have used, including some very, very, very dusty paperback versions of Julius Caesar and whatnot. But I never read them. And what I do remember reading is when I was about 14 or 15, I have an older brother whom I absolutely adore. And he brought home one day this massive volume of the collected books of Shakespeare. So those big, very cheap brown paperback versions. He put on his shelf. Until today, I don't think he ever read it. But I remember distinctly being a teenage girl, very, very bored on my school holidays because there was no television in my house. There were no smartphones back then. So I wandered into his room and I picked it up for lack of anything else to read. And I started with Romeo and Juliet because for some reason that was familiar to me. Read it, didn't understand a thing, but kept reading anyway. And
Yes.
I essentially spent that very long school holidays working my way through um, Romeo and Juliet, most of the comedies, because those seemed to at least have a more interesting storyline. I think I went through a couple of the histories, couldn't make sense of any of the characters. But yes, that was when I started reading Shakespeare.
Right. And how did that translate into your academic career? Was that something that was, already, did that lay the groundwork for that, or did that interest in Shakespeare at an academic level come later?
I don't think I started off my academic journey, as it were, directly interested in Shakespeare. I went into my first degree in English literature in University of Malaya, just because I really enjoyed literature. It was the only thing I could do well, essentially. But Shakespeare was intimidating. And so we had, at least one course on Shakespeare's plays, another one more generally on his sonnets and other Renaissance writers. And it was always intimidating just because the language seemed quite foreign. But eventually, when I was doing my master's still in UM, we had to do a dissertation to be able to graduate. And one of my professors, Professor Lim Chi Sing, was an excellent Shakespearean scholar. He came to me one day and he said, "So, what are you working on for your dissertation?" And I had no idea because I had not decided. And he said, "Well, why don't you look at Shakespeare and I'll supervise you?" And I had always been interested amongst all the genres of literature. I've always enjoyed drama the most. But I don't think I dared think of working on Shakespeare again because it just seemed so intimidating. But having someone come to me and say, "Hey, this is a good idea, and why don't you give it a hand, and I'll help you along the way," that really was what got me started off on seriously looking at Shakespeare within academia.
And did Malaysian adaptations feature at all at that point?
Not really. Not because they weren't being staged. I remember catching a performance of Julius Caesar in Kale, but I wasn't thinking seriously about studying these performances. I suppose it's a mixture of the ignorance and the arrogance of youth, where it felt a bit at that point like, Shakespeare has to be the pure thing. You have to do the real Shakespeare, look at the original words, and any of these adaptations are lesser versions.
Right, right.
I've since been enlightened to discover that those are actually the more exciting bits of Shakespeare in Malaysia at the moment. But at that point, I wasn't particularly interested in Malaysian versions. Yeah.
Yes. And in fact, you not only looked at Shakespeare in that original literary context, you actually looked at Thomas Middleton, which is very rare.
Yes.
Why?
Um.
I know we're going a little bit off from
mm.
Malaysian Shakespeare's at the moment, but could you just talk a little bit about Thomas Middleton's? And for the listeners who don't know, Thomas Middleton is a contemporary of Shakespeare. But so many people look at Shakespeare, but very few, and maybe some people look at Christopher Marlowe, who is a close second. But very few people, certainly in Malaysia, look at Thomas Middleton as a doctoral subject.
Right. Well, it was partly circumstantial because when I started my doctoral studies, there was this massive edition of Middleton's collected books that had just been published by the Oxford University Press. And any jaded academic will tell you, there you go, that's a good topic for you. Something new has come out, so go write about it. And so that was what sparked my interest in Middleton. There is a Shakespearean connection because we believe that some of Shakespeare's plays, things which have been traditionally attributed to Shakespeare, actually, we believe that Middleton had a hand in them. So in Macbeth, for example, the scenes with the witches that is supposedly attributed to Middleton now. But I looked at Thomas Middleton very much within the context of 16th century London, the kinds of places he was writing about, the kind of playhouses he was writing for. And that has, I think, helped me to understand Shakespeare better as well, because Shakespeare was in many ways writing for the same audience, and many of the plays were being performed in these same playhouses as well.
So how did you transition from that into your current research, which is Malaysian Shakespeares, or actually Asian Shakespeares? And maybe,
Right.
yeah, No, let's go. Let's stick with that question first.
Excellent question. Well, I was doing my doctoral work, and as you said, Thomas Middleton is an absolutely foreign name to any Malaysian but myself and the students on whom I inflict it. And so I was feeling this horrible dislocation between what I was doing and what the rest of the world was doing. There is this proverbial ivory tower that academics reside in, right? We're trying very hard to come out of it, but it's still there in many ways. And it doesn't help if you're writing about this very unknown writer and his 16th century London context. So I figured that a good way to bridge what I'm doing and what the rest of the world is doing is to start looking at what Malaysians were up to. And no Malaysian was doing Thomas Middleton. I did have one director friend who came to me and said, there's a lot of excitement in the UK about Thomas Middleton. Should we try staging him? I said, probably not. But there were Shakespeare performances going on. And so I watched those performances, having grown up a little bit since my arrogant undergraduate years, found them really fascinating, and found that a lot of these Malaysian adaptations and Asian adaptations actually spring from a very deep understanding of the original text. So once I was done with my doctoral work, this is the direction that I kind of went into, and which has been really exciting so far.
The term global Shakespeares, Asian Shakespeares, and Malaysian Shakespeares, there's a plural there. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about you could talk about global Shakespeares, but specifically about what Asian Shakespeares is as both a performance tradition and, if you want to use the word tradition, and an academic field, and then what we mean by Malaysian Shakespeares, because I think people are confused, especially by the adding a plural at the end.
Sure, and I know that because every time I write up a document, my word processing software helpfully gives me a little red squiggle to show me I made a grammatical error. But it's a term that is being used definitely by academics just to reflect the sense of plurality. That when we talk about Asian Shakespeares, there is such a wide difference in terms of the historical backgrounds of every nation, and such a wide difference in the way every nation is currently interacting with Shakespeare. And so we think about countries like India and Japan, these would be the places where scholarship on Asian Shakespeare is the most established. We have the most work written about these two countries, but just their experiences are so vastly different, because you have India that was colonized by the English and therefore learned Shakespeare in a very formal way, and the performances also tend to reflect that grounding. Whereas in Japan, you have a nation that was never colonized by the English, but that began to show an interest in Shakespeare as a way of breaking out of the mold of everything that Japan used to stand for. And so Japan's interaction with Shakespeare, not completely, but partly, came from a desire to prove that they were moving forward and that they were opening themselves out to the world. So that even if today you look at the kind of adaptations that come from them, India's got this huge movie industry, of course, and there are multiple films made based on Shakespeare plays, both the very serious ones. We have Bishal Bhattwaj trilogy, which delves into a very serious social commentary. And then there are the more light-hearted Bollywood ones as well, which are perfectly fine and acceptable. In Japan, you've got a very lively stage tradition that's going on there, but also a sense of drawing on things like kabuki and no, and using that to influence their performances. So Asian Shakespeares, just because every nation is so different, even within Southeast Asia, where in some ways there are similar histories, both to our culture and to our languages, but the historical development of the countries have been so very different. So whether you're thinking of Philippines, colonized by the American nation, and Malaysia, colonized by the British, that in itself has made a big difference in the way we react towards Shakespeare. What more if you compare Malaysia then with other countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Singapore? So I think it's a fair term to use, because you don't want to commit the error of assuming that everyone does the same thing. The whole point of scholarship and academia is to kind of bring out the nuances of what we're experiencing. Hence the term Asian Shakespeares. Malaysian Shakespeares, yeah. Sorry, am I?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Malaysian Shakespeares again helps to capture the breadth of what we're talking about. Um, that little quick round that you had just now, you asked me what I think of as being Malaysian Shakespeare, and I highlighted that to me, it's not just theatrical performances, it's also what happens in the classroom and what happens in conversations and on other platforms. Even if you take a more narrow view and just confine it to performances, I think within Malaysia, we aren't flooded with a lot of performances, but the ones that we do have can be very different from one another based on who's performing it, based on the purpose of that particular production.
Yes. In other words, when you use the plural, you're acknowledging the fact that there is a diversity of experiences and that you can't
Absolutely.
reduce anything to a national or regional experience. You mentioned colonialism a while ago, and I'm just wondering it occurred to me that when Shakespeare was writing, that was just at the very start of the colonial process. It's not colonialism as we understand it now. It was at the very start of that in the 16th, 17th century when Shakespeare was born. Could you talk a little bit about and this sounds like a stretch, but whether Shakespeare had any understanding or perception of Malaysia or even of Southeast Asia more generally, or whether there was an overall perception of Southeast Asia in early modern writing?
References to Malaysia in Shakespeare, no, not that I know of at least. Someone might prove me wrong. I'd be very happy to be proven wrong on that. But we do have reference to India, for example. And so in the Midsummer Night's Dream, quite famously, you have the fairy king and queen, Titania and Oberon, and they're fighting over this boy who is referred to as the Indian boy. And in describing the backstory to this boy's origin, we have references to the spiced Indian air and the idea of ships bringing back merchandise. And so that gives us a snapshot into what's happening in Shakespeare's time. The idea that that's when you have international trade coming up. That's when you have merchants based in London who are pooling their resources together in order to travel to all these other nations and to bring back spices, cinnamon, cloves, what have you. So in many ways, you find that references have a lot to do with trade. And repeatedly in Shakespeare's plays, you'll find references to international trade. Shakespeare himself doesn't speak about these as directly as some of his other peers. Thomas Middleton, for example, makes direct references to it. Even a writer like Ben Jonson makes much more specific references to countries and to specific items being imported back into England. Shakespeare doesn't make quite such distinct and specific references, but there's no doubt that he knew what was going on because he would have been living in London, where the merchant company would have been based. And he was a very savvy businessman. So there's no doubt that he was aware of what was going on around him.
I think Middleton wrote The Island Princess, right?
Not the Island Princess, but he was writing a lot of civic shows. These were annual shows that are basically like their version of the National Day parades that we have every year.
Yeah.
These would have been the parades that went through the streets of London. And as part of that, they were celebrating the things that London was doing. So they would actually show, there would actually be people on little carriages throwing out spices, throwing out gifts, just to remind Londoners of what great exploits they were undertaking at that point.
Yes. You talked a little bit about the Indian boy, and it occurred to me that Malaysia, Southeast Asia is a modern construct anyway, and that really
Yes,
this
very much so.
region was seen as an extension of India. And of course, Malaysia and Indonesia heavily influenced by Indian civilization. The other thing that occurred to me was that you have, and this moving away from Asia specifically, but we do have the presentation of natives in other plays, and most famously
True.
in, let's say, post-colonial literature now. There's, of course, the presentation of Caliban in The Tempest. And for those people who don't know, The Tempest is a play about it's about a wizard on an island and presumably somewhere, I think, off the coast of Africa, although it's never clear. But Caliban is a native of the island, and he's, in a sense, colonized by the protagonist. Could you talk a little
That's
bit
right.
about the presentation of Caliban and how it can be read in perhaps differing ways?
Sure, I'm glad you brought that up. So The Tempest is this one play that has become really important in post-colonial readings, because Traditionally, it's been understood that Prospero, this magician who comes and inhabits the island, that he represents Shakespeare. For a long time, the fashion was to read Shakespeare's plays biographically, and therefore, based on that, scholarship have told us that Prospero represents Shakespeare himself as an Asian playwright, and at the end of the play, when Prospero leaves his magic behind, that is Shakespeare's farewell to the stage. A lot of that, of course, is based on conjecture. We don't actually have hard evidence for any of that. And it's always dangerous when you try reading certain characters as a playwright, because the whole magic of being a playwright is the ability to transfer various parts of yourselves into different characters. But that was the traditional reading. And based on that reading, a character like Caliban, who is described to us as being half fish, a bit like a monster, he's presented as this really abhorrent creature who deserves to be mistreated, deserves to be taught a good lesson, and he tries to stand up for himself. And by the end of the play, deserves to be left behind on the island while everybody else leaves and goes on to better things. But the post-colonial reading has challenged that and presented Caliban as a figure for the experience of those who are colonized. That we have this, power who comes in suddenly, invading onto your space, demanding the right to govern your space and to govern you, and on top of that, to dictate and define who you are. So post-colonial readings would emphasize that the ways in which Caliban is described in the play, those are actually words spoken out by different characters. And so that's their perception of him. He may not look like a monster at all. In fact, there are some performances which present him looking like a completely normal, average-looking human. And that just highlights that really he's being taught to see himself in a particular way. And this is part of that larger enterprise to be able to dominate him and his resources.
Yes. And that really leads very nicely to my next question, because one of the first posts that we did, that I did, it's just me at the moment, that got traction was the post I did about the Sultan Idris Training College and how Shakespeare had been staged there by the students in Malay, and how there was a bit of a conflict, because on the one hand it was being clearly an effort at indoctrination, trying to present British culture to the students through Malay, but on the other hand it became something of a threat to the colonial government. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the introduction of Shakespeare into not just Malaya necessarily, but Malaysia in general. What was the first introduction that we have? Did it start with colonial that colonial agenda, or were there other avenues?
Right. Well, scholars tell us that actually the earliest recorded performances of Shakespeare would have occurred in the late 1800s. And so this would have been before the introduction of colonial education formally in Malaysia. So we know that there were these bangsawan troops. Essentially, they were traveling troops that presented a form of live theatre, including, some tragic portions, lots of comedy, music, dance. It was just kind of a whole package. And many of these troops that were traveling around had a whole breadth of plays within their repertoire. And so they might on one night perform, something based on an Indian classical text, and then the next day perform an adaptation of a Shakespearean play. So we know that there were troops coming in, Parsi troops, for example, that were performing in Malaya in the 1880s and 1890s, and they were performing variations or adaptations of plays like Hamlet, for example. So that in many ways would have been the earliest recorded presence of Shakespeare in Malaysia. It's not actually the education system. Later on, you do have Shakespeare being formalized as part of the education system. And I think there is a degree of nuance necessary here in the sense that not all English language schools were by the British colonial administration. You have, for example, the mission schools, and those were set up with a completely different desire altogether. And in those situations, your educators would have been looking at perhaps evangelizing, reaching out to poorer communities. But eventually what happens is that the British administration decides that all English language schools must teach the Cambridge syllabus. And within that Cambridge syllabus, there is that compulsory Shakespeare component. So in Malaysia, as in countries like India, for example, that comes in, and with it is the idea that in teaching literature, you are imbibing the native citizen values, teaching them the values, the social mores, as well as the language of the colonizer, and implicitly also teaching them that this is to be highly regarded and that everything that they have traditionally from their own backgrounds is second class. From there, we then have performances also, a lot of school performances. So places like Victoria Institution, for example, were famous for their school performances. And their productions really served a pedagogical purpose. It gave the students a chance to actually enact what they were studying. And then these troops would then go traveling around other schools. And it gave students in other schools the opportunity to actually watch a performance of the text they were studying for the examinations. So in that sense, there was a very clear direction in the way Shakespeare was being brought to these schools through the educational system. Whether the intent of the British colonial administration was always achieved, I think that's questionable,
Right.
because we know that there can be a disjunct between the official order and the teachers themselves. And then from the teachers on to the students, right? There are all these little holes along the way where people are able to not just accept wholesale everything they've been told, but to actually look at it critically and to think about where they fit in and how they might use the Shakespearean text to do something, to say something that they want to say.
Yes, exactly. And just before we move on, these performances were, I mean, I know O.T. Dasek translated, the Sultan Idris Training College translated them into Malay. But in general, were they in English? Were they the abridged versions, or were they the versions of the plays as studied in the...
Sure. Those like VI, for example, and these other ones, they were meant to teach the text. And so they were in the original language, and they tried as far as possible to stick to what they thought a Shakespearean production should look like.
Yes. So that's the colonial period. And then of course we have the whole struggle for independence and eventually, of course, Malaya is independent, but they retain the school system as a general rule. And then you have I think, the National Cultural Policy in 1970. And there are a lot of debates about the use of language. And if we look at scholars of Malaysian drama, you see that they talk a lot about the nationalization of drama, whether it's at the government level or countercultural level. How did that affect the performance of Shakespeare in I think about the 70s or 80s? What happened?
It had a huge impact in the 70s. Prior to that, you'll find that we have a record of Shakespeare being performed by multiple groups. There's the MATG, the Malaysian Arts Theatre Group, for example, and then there's the LIDRA, the Literary and Dramatic Association, based in the English department in UM. And Shakespeare was a mainstay of their performances. But with the National Cultural Policy, I think practitioners and writers were very committed to this idea. They wanted to see the nation come together as a united nation. They deeply believe in this idea of a national identity and a national culture. And so you find them consciously moving away from performing anything that might represent this British colonial experience. And what could be more, typical of that than Shakespeare? So you find that in the 70s, there's an emphasis on performing works by writers like Edward Laurel, Ki Tuan Chai, Shin San Sui. So local writers coming up with original content that speaks to local experience. Occasionally, there will be performances of these more canonical writers, but these tended to be writers who are known for their social commentary. Writers like George Bernard Shaw, writers like Anthony Chekhov, hardly anything by Shakespeare. So it was a very deliberate move away from this.
So at what point was Shakespeare reintroduced into performance? I know we didn't stop performing Shakespeare, but at what point did that start to become a trend again, as it were?
Yeah, I think it's very closely connected with the larger developments within the country. It looks to me that the practitioners, from that wave of idealism and excitement, began to realize that things were perhaps not as simple as they had hoped. And so eventually what you find is a move back towards Shakespeare, but a very deliberate attempt to now present Shakespeare on their own terms. Um, and this I think is one way in which you do we talked about variations across Asia, but you do find this quite often happening in nations that have been colonized. The initial complete rejection of anything to do with the colonizers, and then coming back to it, but negotiating it on a different, in a different sort of relationship, no longer feeling obliged to try and perform Shakespeare the way they've been taught that Shakespeare should be performed. But the courage and the innovation to actually take Shakespeare and to use Shakespeare to say something for themselves. So by the time you get to the late 90s and certainly the early 2000s, you find companies like Instant Cafe Theatre, for example, performing Shakespeare. They had one performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream. It was an outdoor performance. Sadly, we don't have documentation. We can speak to those who are part of the ICT, of course, but we don't have recordings of the performance. In 2000, we have a performance again by the ICT, this time of The Merchant of Venice. And that one's a very deliberate attempt to use The Merchant of Venice to talk about what is viewed as social inequalities and discrimination within the country. So Shakespeare does come back eventually, but it's a different sort of Shakespeare.
Yeah, you mentioned that actually leads very nicely into the next question, because you were talking a little bit about presenting social issues through Shakespeare. So I'm wondering, one of the trends that I see personally is the use of Shakespeare as almost like a Trojan horse implies something negative, but using Shakespeare as a vehicle to deal with issues that would otherwise be considered sensitive or would be considered too politically subversive. So you mentioned Merchant of Venice a while ago, and that deals with racial discrimination. Could you talk a little bit about how Malaysian productions have used Shakespeare to deal with those controversial issues?
Right. So the ICT production of The Merchant of Venice, you have, of course, in The Merchant of Venice, Shylock, who is this, extremely rich social outcast. Again, for many years, it was believed that Shylock would be played as a comic figure. But eventually, readings have highlighted that he stands up as a tragic hero, almost for the way in which he is persecuted within his context. And so that ICT production had Patrick Teo playing the role of Shylock, and speaking in a slightly Chinese accent. And then he was surrounded by a group of characters. The young Christian Venetians in Shakespeare's play had become this young Melayu Baru sort of cast, and they were obviously using the play to comment on things like the NEP and the policies that were being rolled out in Malaysia. More recently, you have a production like Datuk Sri, for example, which played in 2016 and again 2018. And that again is a really good reinvention where they've taken Macbeth and used it to make a critical commentary on the government within Malaysia and what is seen as political figures who are like a Macbeth, who are misusing their power, who don't mind using violence if they have to, who are absolutely corrupt, and who try very hard to hold on to that power that they have. So Shakespeare has always been a good starting point, I think, because to begin with, you can say, I'm just performing Shakespeare. And in that way, you kind of validate your performance as something that, it's nothing new. We're not doing anything sensitive. It's just Shakespeare. On the other hand, because your audiences know the play, they are able to pick up quite quickly on the themes that you're trying to introduce. And if you make changes to certain characters or certain scenes, they also pick up on that and they can tell what you are trying to do by using a very established British writer.
We're talking about political issues in the sense of topical issues. But of course, art forms can be political as well or controversial. And we have seen attempts to, in a sense, revive what was at one point considered controversial traditional theatre through Shakespeare. There was an effort by Edin Khoo to stage Shakespeare, stage Macbeth using wayang kulit at a point when the art form was being banned. It never happened, but there was an attempt.
Yeah.
And of course, as you know very well, there's Nurzizi Zulkifli's landmark production of Mak Yong Titi Sakti, which is an adaptation of Mak Yong for an adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream for Mak Yong, which again was also an art form that was banned in Kelantan. Could you talk a little bit about how traditional theatre, not necessarily Malay theatre, but also things like Chinese opera, have been used in adaptations of Shakespeare in Malaysia?
Yeah, they have made a number of experiments. So Chin Sun Sui, for example, directed a Macbeth in Chinese opera costumes. No, Zizi Zulkifli, of course, did both the Mak Yong, Titis Sakti, and then recently Randai Macbeth. And um, I think with Zizi Zulkifli's work, there's a very intentional attempt to kind of revive these art forms and to really expose an urban audience to them. Um, the majority of us Malaysians, certainly I have never actually witnessed a Mak Yong performance in its original form. I had never heard of Randai until I was, about to go and watch this Randai Macbeth. So I did some quick Googling, as all respectable academics do. I did some quick Googling on Randai to discover what this whole art form was about. And so in that sense, it's a very deliberate attempt to kind of revive a traditional art form, which I think is really successful. Zulkifli's Mak Yong Titi Sakti is this one production that continues to, in many ways, represent Malaysian Shakespeare when you come to a global stage. It is the one production that has been archived, that has been studied and written about in multiple countries where Asian Shakespeares is being taught. So it's really been effective in that sense of introducing this art form not only to the Kale audience who would have come to Kale Pack to watch it, but also to an international audience. Just as we see a breadth of Malaysian Shakespeares, I think even Shakespeares which try to bring in local art forms vary very much one from another. And so you have Zulkifli's attempt, and then you have other attempts perhaps which feature the original text, but the don't bring in elements from the traditional art form quite as much as Zulkifli's one does. So you could, for example, have a performance where you have, an interlude with Bharatanatyam dancers, for example, or you have Chinese opera costumes being put onto the actors. And I think it really comes down to a question of the background from which these practitioners come. In order to be able to really bring together two traditions, you need a very deep understanding of both art forms. And it's really difficult to arrive at that level of expertise when you know both your Shakespearean text and your traditional art form really, really well. Most people, because human beings have limitations, most people would be more well-versed in one rather than the other. And that really shows in the way the production is executed.
Of course, we've been talking about, Shakespeare in political context, we've been talking about traditional theatre, but then, of course, Shakespeare had a dominant role in Malaysian education, certainly in Malaya. And of course, one of the most prominent performers of Shakespeare today are the Kale Shakespeare players. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about their influence and also how you first got to know them, because I know you've worked with them quite closely, and I think probably the only academic articles that have been written about their performances have been by you.
Right. Well, I had the privilege of catching their second performance in 2012. They started off in 2011 with, I think, Julius Caesar, if I remember correctly. And then 2012, they did a version of The Merchant of Venice. And I was just mentioning to my husband that day that I've actually caught every single Shakespearean production of theirs since then, which is really, really fascinating because I've had the chance to see this company grow and to see them experiment with different styles and to see the ways in which they discover what works for them and what works for Malaysian audiences and what doesn't. So what Kale Shakespeare Players does is that it takes the Shakespearean text and the backbone of their productions would be the ones targeted at school audiences. So they have the Shakespeare Demystified series that is targeted at probably secondary school, pre-university students. And then they have a storytelling Shakespeare series, which is focused on younger children. It's very interactive, lots of parts where the audience is invited to get up and dance, shout, participate. And what they do is, I think they help to bring the text alive for school students today. It's become a truism in Shakespearean education that the text is not meant to be read; it's meant to be seen. But in Malaysia, how often do you get to watch a Shakespearean production? And so, what the Kale Shakespeare Players does is that they typically tour around the schools, and there the students get to actually watch these plays being performed, so that eventually, when they step into the classroom and they learn about these plays, they at least know what the storyline is like, and they get a sense of the emotional effect as well. Because it's really hard just from reading a text, especially if, typically we don't read the entire Shakespeare text in a classroom from the start to the end. You can't. So it's really hard to explain to your students that, well, when you come to Act 5, this is how you should feel. You will probably feel a sense of anger or empathy. That's very artificial. Whereas being able to sit through a performance...
It's just telling
That's right. So you get to actually sit down and see how it might work out. And I think that just bridges the gap between the text and the student. So they actually get to, experience the way it should be experienced. They don't perform it from the first to the last line without editing. It's just not realistic because you can't block off 3 or 4 hour slots for a group of students. So they tend to abridge their material and adapt it. As I said, for the children, it's very participatory. For the slightly older audiences, they're expected to sit through most of it, but it's still adapted. So what they've done really is to help teachers, I think, be able to... I think they've just made teachers' jobs much easier than it would have been without the chance to watch from their performances. Along the line, also, they have their more experimental productions where they have had, brutal Shakespeare, versions of King Lear, for example, and that's much more experimental. But that's not the backbone of what they do.
Yes, I think they did a version of Titus Andronicus, which I don't think would have been for children, because that's an incredibly brutal play on many levels.
Yes. It was actually really well executed. But you're right, not necessarily for kids.
Just before we move on, well, actually, this is an important question, because you were talking about education, and so I assume that they may have performed for you in UM. In fact, I know they did so once. But it occurred to me that when I was in school, I went to government school, and the only compulsory component we had for Shakespeare was, I think, when I was in Form 1, the soliloquy, Life's Brief Candle, which was called Life's Brief Candle, soliloquy, the Tomorrow soliloquy from Macbeth, and then one of the sonnets in Form 4, and that was it. And if you did Shakespeare, it was when you did English literature as a subject. And to be honest, I didn't do the Shakespeare play. I did a different play. So what exactly is the status of Shakespeare in Malaysian education today? And when I say Malaysian education, I don't just mean the government school system, but also the rise of private schools.
Yeah, you've hit on a pet peeve of mine, that we have a whole generation of young Malaysians walking around who will say, I know Shakespeare, there's that poem called Life's Brief Candle, and it's not a poem, it's part of Macbeth's speech. And to rip it out, not even the entire part of the speech, to rip it out and to package it and to tell students, here's a poem. That's really doing Shakespeare a disservice. So that even that component, I believe, has been removed.
Okay.
I can't decide whether I'm sad that Shakespeare's been removed from the syllabus, or whether I'm glad that he's no longer being misrepresented to many school children. But you are right. That means that the vast majority of Malaysians school-going children do not encounter Shakespeare. What has happened, very unfortunately, is that Shakespeare has now become the domain of the mainly middle-class children whose parents decide to send them to this international schools, as it were, schools that teach, usually the Cambridge A-level syllabus. And there they would encounter Shakespeare. It's also there that you have companies like Kale Shakespeares coming in. So it has, I think, unfortunately led to a bit of a class divide, where increasingly the students who know about Shakespeare will be the students whose parents were wealthy enough to send them to this school and to allow them to buy into this cultural capital. That said, I fully understand why there was a felt need to remove Shakespeare, because there was the argument that the fluency in the language isn't there. There's the sense that you need to give the children something that they can appreciate more. You shouldn't idolize Shakespeare. I can see where these arguments are coming from. I don't completely agree with them. I think that if you are careful to choose the right parts of Shakespeare, it can be very accessible, and it doesn't have to be a completely alien concept. In fact, the whole idea of studying literature is to be able to experience something that you wouldn't typically experience in your daily life, right? The whole idea of studying literature is to be able to empathize with someone who is outside of your situation. And as long as we confine children to reading about things that they already know about, we are limiting their capacity to imagine in that way. So I think it is unfortunate, and it is a problem. So, there have been instances where the Kale Shakespeares, for example, have toured to some government schools, but that is, very much dependent on funding. So if someone decides to fund them, then they can take their production and tour around. But otherwise, unfortunately, we are going to have this increasing gap, which I think is not, I mean, we're using Shakespeare to talk about it, but it is really, a gap that is cutting across various sections of society, the issues that we talk about in terms of, the education system in Malaysia and what's happening there, the sense of, what's happening socially as well, where there's getting to be a larger divide between the haves and the have-nots. So I think Shakespeare just becomes one little peep into this larger social environment.
Yes.
And what the nation is at the moment. So, my own children go to government school, and I've been wondering when I can, get this group in to perform for the students in their school. But relatively speaking, it is going to be a challenge.
Yes, and well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Shakespeare, as you pointed out, we're talking about it in relation to Shakespeare, but really it's a mirror of a broader problem, and that does lead me to some of my other questions, which is the fact that Shakespeare tends to be a mirror for the times, and there is this idea of Shakespeare being universal. On the other side of things, we have this idea that Shakespeare, he's bound to his particular time and place, and in a post-colonial context, there's a bit of a conflict, because on the one hand, we have this kind of love-hate relationship, that on the one hand, he's kind of represents, in a very difficult, for lack of a better word, brutal history of colonization. And there are aspects of the plays that are highly problematic, not even in relation to race, but also gender. On the other hand, there's a lot of richness in those plays. How do you feel about that? Do you think that we should continue studying, performing? I mean, I know you have vested interest in this.
Please do, I shall be out of a job.
yeah. But in all seriousness, I mean, how do we navigate that conflict?
I think we are on the right track where performances are concerned. I talked about how Shakespearean performances came back, but it was very much an idea of taking Shakespeare on our terms. And if you just look at the Shakespearean performances in Malaysia over the last 10 or 20 years, you will find that very few people try to stage Shakespearean plays in their entirety. Very few try to perform Shakespeare in the so-called original setting, whether that's ancient Rome or Venice. Instead, the push has been to take Shakespeare and to use it as something that we can use to talk about the things that interest us. So I think there needs to be a healthy attitude towards Shakespeare as not to be idolized, But to recognize that here's a really good piece of writing which opens up opportunities for us to think. I think at the end of the day, literature, in any form, is meant to be a tool to think with. And so if we can use Shakespeare as a way to think through our individual crisis, to think through our social moments, then that's the way forward. And so there shouldn't be a fear of playing around with the text. There shouldn't be a fear of changing things where they need to be changed. There are some parts of Shakespeare, especially when it comes to the comedies and the jokes, those are really, really specific to his moment. He talks about events that probably were in the papers, the week before. And it's completely lost on audiences today. And it doesn't serve any purpose in that sense. But if you can take a moment like that and use it to reference something contemporary, then that's where the play still becomes powerful. And that's where it still becomes useful. So whether it's a matter of, just taking the storyline and then, recreating some characters if you need to, or if it's a matter of translating the text, but again, taking the liberty to modernize words which may not be accessible today, or to bring in cultural ideas within the language itself, then that I think is where it's worth still doing Shakespeare. Because like, he knows what he's doing. He's brilliant at his craft. So take all of the gold that is in there. Feel free to get rid of the things which are not necessarily dross, but perhaps not relevant anymore. But use it to think through the different issues that we are dealing with today in Malaysia.
Yes. We've been talking about Shakespeare's journey, but we're going to wrap up soon. And I'm just wondering for yourself, first of all, you could tell us, if you like, any projects you're working on now. But where has the journey, how has your understanding of Shakespeare, indeed of literature and Malaysian drama, changed over time? I know, I would, when you hear to go back in time and talk to that teenage girl who picked up this Romeo and Juliet, what would you tell her? What would you tell her?
Well, like most, well, I wouldn't say most, but many academics I know, I never thought of going to academia. I wasn't the straight A student in school. But I think that basic love for literature is what has been the driving force throughout. And what I find today is I'm constantly surprised by how relevant Shakespeare is. I shouldn't be surprised, right? I'm the one who should be preaching about its relevance, but I'm constantly surprised because being a literature student is quite a niche thing. You're used to being, the oddball in society to be a literature major. Being the literature major who focuses on Shakespeare makes you even more niche. And I've always just assumed that I'm doing this strange thing that no one else really would be interested in. But the more I talk to my students, the more I'm surprised by how often they introduce me to adaptations of Shakespeare which they have encountered in their Gen Z experience, zombie movies and tweets and whatnot. So they constantly surprise me by showing me how Shakespeare is still very much in their popular culture. And then I have students who come to me wanting to do their research on Shakespeare. They are obviously struggling with the language, but there's something in it that speaks to them. Certain characters, certain themes, which they say, I really feel a connection to this play or to this character. And, there's been so much effort, I think, to try and repackage Shakespeare in a way to popularize it with young people. So the whole manga Shakespeare thing, for example, is very, very popular. And there's been a lot of hype about it, both in America and the UK. I thought I would be hip and happening, so trying to define my age, I brought the manga Shakespeare into the classroom and assigned it as reading for one of us. And the reviews I got were quite damning. My students said, this is horrible. It's really bad manga and it's really bad Shakespeare. I'm not afraid to talk about manga, but they assured me that that was badly written and badly done as a manga. But interestingly, they told me that, it's lost what was speaking to them in the Shakespearean text.
Right.
And so I'm constantly surprised, pleasantly surprised, but constantly surprised to find that Shakespeare is still very much in the Malaysian consciousness, and that there are still these elemental things that speak to people without needing to be dressed up necessarily.
Dr. Kok Su Mei, thank you so much, and all the best with everything that you do, and thank you for gracing us with your presence. And to everybody else, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever. Gentles all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. Bye.
Thanks, Doc.